Today we are talking bears and hibernation, and we're joined by Mark Vieira, who's our Carnivore and Furbearer program manager for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And Mark, maybe just start us off and take us through a little bit about hibernation. When and where does it occur?
Sure. Bear hibernation is a physiological response that bears go through, brought on by the lack of food, which occurs in the fall, in conjunction with changes in temperature and some of these sort of genetic predispositions they already have for this physiological change that goes on during the wintertime. We see bears in sort of northern climates where food's unavailable for longer parts of the year, hibernating 6 to 7 months, and then in much more temperate southern parts of southeastern U.S. and even into Mexico and other southern ranges of bear species, almost no hibernation or much abbreviated couple months timeline. And again, that's really driven by the availability of food that we have or don't have in these different climate ranges, at least in North America.
So we've seen a couple of instances across the state recently where bears have been out and active, and sometimes it's getting into trash, and maybe you just answered a little bit, but when bears go in to hibernate and maybe come back out, can you just talk about why maybe people could see that in instances when they think they should be hibernating?
Sure. Again, bears are going to start hibernation largely driven by the lack of food resources on the ground. I was talking to our Michael Sirachman down at our Frisco Creek Rehab Center, and the way that we get those orphan cubs to begin hibernation is to just over the course of a week or two wean them off food. It's that simple. They start to they're outside, they've got the temperature clues, and they're going in the den. Now, if you've got a situation where there are food resources available for bears longer, that's a possibility for going into the den and hibernating later, or perhaps not quite fully establishing a hibernation process and coming out and investigating food resources. Temperature can be an issue as well. And then I guess I would say in situations where bears are around people, they may choose places to hibernate that are close enough to human use where they're actually being disturbed. Some of the bear work that we've done, and I can touch on this in a second here about exactly what are bears in hibernation, or are they doing something else that's not quite as deep as technically hibernation. But absolutely, bears can be awoken by disturbance while they're in their den and very quickly arouse and react to that. So it could be that you've got a bear choosing to hibernate under a deck of an unoccupied home, but come late December, folks are using that house to go skiing and they're stomping around on the deck, and that animal's disturbed, wakes up, and is actually able to fully arouse and come out of hibernation in just a matter of minutes, where we might then see them out on the landscape looking for food. There's no food around, and a week or two later they're back in hibernation again.
Why don't you take us a little bit and explain what does a typical bear den look like?
It's pretty interesting. We've a number of us have done some work around Colorado and been in bear dens. They tend to be on steeper slopes, not always. Often they're looking for 20 to 40% grade slopes, and in theory that's got to do with that steepness, particularly on north-facing sides, should provide a little more insulation, longer snow cover, so thermally it's a little more insulated, and then probably as a defense against disturbance on those slopes. But they are clean. Bears often pull in pine needles or grass and kind of create a bed. Again, while bears are hibernating, they don't defecate or urinate, so these dens smell like pine needles or like grass. They're often fairly narrow. I mean, there can be dens that a person could get in and stand up, but typically these dens are a little narrower and tighter. The ones on the northern Front Range that I've been in the most tend to be right underneath big rock piles, and often have rock. Sides of the dens are partly rock and partly dirt.
So come springtime, a couple months down from now, when the grasses start being available, that's when that's one of the first food sources that they'll come out and eat on. Is that correct?
Right. So when bears are hibernating, they're and just to touch on the term hibernation, A lot of scientists would argue that bears aren't true hibernators. They're actually in torpor. And the difference between torpor and hibernation is the fact that their bears' heart rate and metabolism are slowed down significantly. However, their body temperature just drops a very small amount, whereas true hibernators like ground squirrels are almost frozen, so their body temperature is greatly reduced. So when a bear's hibernating, it's in this situation where it's still burning a fair amount of calories and needing a fair amount of energy, which is the fat that it's stored through the summer and early fall in the den. And as they come out of the den emergence, which typically is males earlier, then females without cubs, and the last bears to come out of the den are the females of the year with that year's cubs, are coming out in that later April timeline. Their bodies are needing to adjust to the fact that they haven't consumed anything for sometimes 6 months. So absolutely, there's this phase that's referred to sometimes as walking hibernation, where they're out in the landscape, kind of moving slowly, eating what tends to be more vegetative material to kind of start to pass through their system to get their bodies ready for that early summer food sources, which move back into the typical omnivore diet things that we see bears eating in the rest of the year.
All right. Well, there is just a little bit of information for your knowledge on bears and hibernation. And Mark, we thank you for your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks very much.